Welcome to Spiritual Psychology. My name's Renee McKenna. I'm a therapist and shamanic healer. And today I want to talk about death and the idea of making friends with death or viewing death as a teacher. You know, life is fatal. No one gets out of here alive. With all the variety of things that can happen in our lifetime, we have two things in common as humans. We're born and we die. Whether we get married or stay single, whether we work or don't work, whether we have a home or no home, whether we have food to eat or whether we're hungry, we're ultimately all headed in the same direction. The circumstances of our death, the cause, the quality of it, how long we live before it happens, that's all unique to each person. You know, there are some traditions that believe that the moment of your death is the most important moment of your whole life, particularly if one believes in the continuity of the soul or the possibility of reincarnation. There are those who believe that the moment of our death determines the circumstances of our rebirth. If you're a student of science in the material world, you might believe that death is the end and we dissolve and kind of recycled or simply absorbed back into the earth, and our mind and our psyche shut down like shutting down a computer. But you know, I was talking to my friend Stephanie this week, and she was present at her father's passing, and she said, you know, I really didn't have any preconceived notions about stuff like this, but at the moment of his death, I felt and saw his spirit rise up out of his body. It was really profound and beautiful and comforting. She's Italian and she's spent a lot of time in Italy, and she talked about how differently they manage death in Italy. It's a much more traditional way of managing the dead, how the dead were managed for millennia before the modern age. A person died at home. They were cared for by their family. The body was cleaned, and they were laid out in the house, and friends and relatives and neighbors would come to the house to pay their respects. Food was shared. It's the precursor to the modern wake that often happens in a funeral home. And the body would stay in the house for a couple days until it started to not look so good, and then the person was buried. Most people I know are terrified of death. They've never seen a dead body, much less washed or touched or dressed one. If they have seen a dead body, it's usually been laid out with lots of makeup done by a stranger. Most people die in a hospital or care facility. Death is viewed as something that needs to be managed by professionals. And yet it's the most natural thing in life. Again, it's the only thing that we will all go through. Most of our experience with death right now is on TV. Violent death, murder. Death is scary. It's horror movies. It's being killed unexpectedly and violently. I remember my friend Christine. She was one of the more frightened people I've known. She had a list of phobias that probably wouldn't fit on one page. She couldn't ride in elevators. She couldn't drive over bridges. She didn't like to be on the highway. And she was terrified of death. We couldn't even talk about it, which isn't unusual in America. And her grandmother got sick, and she loved her grandma. And grandma got sicker quicker, and Christine spent more and more time with her. And she and her mother and her sister were there when her grandma died. And she had an opportunity to do what they did in Italy. They sat with the body. They didn't call anybody right away. And she held her grandma's hand until it got cold. And they washed her hair. And they changed her clothes. And Christine said it was the most peaceful, loving experience that she had ever had. And she wasn't afraid of death anymore, because it was so natural to be with her grandma's body. And she felt, like Stephanie did, that something had left her grandma, that grandma had left. And although she was familiar with the body, it no longer held the person that she loved. But that wasn't scary for her. In fact, it was a comfort. So much of what's happening with COVID-19 is driven by a fear of death. From a medical perspective, death is the enemy. It's a failure. I know 2 people who have lost elders in the last month, and both of those old people had to die alone in a hospital. With both of them, the doctor said, "Oh no, they should be here. We can keep them on machines and give them medication." But because of the pandemic, the family couldn't come and visit, and they just let the medical system handle it. Because we live in a system that doesn't value caring for emotions and the spirit, the primary concern is the physical body. So great-grandma was kept alive for extra days in the hospital. Days she got to spend alone, surrounded by strangers, while her family talked to her on FaceTime. They watched her die on video. When I was about 17, I was talking to a family friend who was an older man, and he said to me, "You know, Renee, at the end of your life, what really matters is who's standing around you looking down while you're dying, and how they feel about you, and how you made them feel about themselves. Doesn't matter how much money you got in the bank, how fancy the house is. What matters is the people you've touched in your life." That stuck with me because I know it's true. I've buried a lot of people. I've been present with a lot of people dying, animals too. I work with the dead a lot in my practice. Souls that haven't crossed over, souls that need healing to make their own peace. Ancestors that act like angels often come to help my clients with the work they want to do. I don't know about reincarnation, but I know about the continuity of the soul because I feel it. And I know that if we pay attention to death, it teaches us how to live. When I turned 50, I took a retreat in the desert for about 5 days. It was a really profound experience. I wasn't out like eating locusts and honey or anything. I was staying in a really nice retreat center where they cooked beautiful meals for me, and I got to meet with someone as a spiritual advisor. I love New Mexico, and we went out into some BLM land that had some sacred Native American sites on it, and we were sitting up on a mesa, and it was sunset, and it felt like a metaphor. At 50, I could see the horizon line of my life. As the sun set, I knew that's going to happen to me someday. I've probably already passed the halfway point. And what do I want to do with the next 25, 35, or 40 years that I have left? My parents both died at 72. If I follow them, I have 16 years left. I'm banking on a lot more than that, but it's a sobering thought. What do I want to do with that time? That experience compelled me to write my book and to leave my marriage. Life is not short, but it is fatal, and how we spend each day is up to us. And keeping an eye on death makes me pay attention. It lights a fire under my ass to do things now. If you've ever had anyone in your life die suddenly and unexpectedly, it can make you want to kiss your kids every time before you leave the house. Tell them you love them, just in case. A lot of us spend considerable time and energy contemplating how to change the world, how to fix the world's problems. And I wonder if that's the right perspective. This plane of existence is fraught with difficulty and challenge. What if the point is not to change the world, but to let the world change us? And if we live deeply each moment, right up to the moment of our death, death itself can change us. My parents were divorced for 20 years before they died. They died 8 months apart. They were both very frightened people, and although I tried the best I could, there really was never healing or resolution in either of those relationships. My mother and I played out the same dysfunctional dynamic we had played out for 40 years in the days leading up to her death. The saddest thing about my parents' death is that I wasn't sad. I was relieved because both of those relationships had been tremendously painful for me. And when they died, the pain stopped. 5 people went to my mother's funeral, and 3 of them were with me. That's instructive. I hope for better. But I had a client this week come to me. His father passed away in Europe. He wasn't able to go because of the pandemic. He hated his father. We had many sessions talking about his father, how he drank the food money, and how they had to burn fabric to stay warm, and how their mother suffered, and what a source of shame their father was. And Daddy got cancer, and they started to talk on Zoom. And in the weeks leading up to his death, an amazing thing happened. He got to tell my client everything my client wished to hear. His father told him he was proud of him. He said he felt terrible because he'd been a bad dad, and that he could never forgive himself for how his drinking had made Mommy suffer. Although he may not have lived a great life, he had a really good death. And amazingly, my client has peace and has forgiven him. Most of us have a terribly immature relationship with death. Our egos can't handle the idea. It's like we stick our fingers in our ears and go, la, 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 la. Don't talk about death. I don't want to think of it. We squeeze our eyes tight. No, no, no. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to think about it. And it drives people. It drives our society in really unhealthy ways. It drives us to hoard and gather much more than we need of anything, hoping to get more toys than anybody else before we disappear. Drives us to try to keep a body alive at the expense of a spirit, and to seek quantity of life over quality. In certain Buddhist traditions, there's a practice called Maranasati. It's a meditation on death. I've had the opportunity to do it in a couple different ways. It's really powerful. And the practice is to sense or feel or imagine yourself dying, and your senses begin to dissolve. Your sight, your hearing, and your different systems begin to collapse. Your breathing, your circulation, your heartbeat, your brain function. And then your body begins to decompose. And then your bones begin to decompose. And then you return into the earth. There's a Tibetan Buddhist practice of dying, also very powerful. In Tibetan Buddhism, they believe that the soul hangs out for around 40 days before it reincarnates and kind of goes on a little trip through what they call the bardo, which is kind of like a little obstacle course of all of our unresolved emotional issues. Karma, in a Tibetan Buddhist perspective, is quite a complicated, it's much more than just cause and effect, but where we get stuck or caught in our unresolved issues is generally what will direct our circumstances of our incarnation in the next life. That's the idea that the moment of your death is the most important moment. And a lot of monks and nuns practice dying. We get to do it for a weekend one time. I probably died like 9 times. It was really cool. Anyway, it really is actually. In fact, it was super instructive because the first realm of the bardo that we went to was what they call the hell realm. And it's not like Christian hell. It's more about rage and anger, and I'm kind of a hell being, and immediately my rage and anger at my mother particularly came up. I got caught right away. It was super instructive. I spent about the next 6 months really actively dissolving my resentment against my mother. And I have to say, I've forgiven her now. I should do that practice again. I'm sure I'll get caught in some other place. I really should. It's interesting what you can do. Whatever your understanding or misunderstanding or lack of understanding about what happens when we die or after, it's imperative to come out of denial and to confront the reality of death on a regular basis, because death teaches us how to live. Death is not a mistake. It's not a tragedy. It's not a failure. It's a doorway and a big step on our path. And if we pay attention to it, it can be one of the greatest teachers that we have in how to live. I'm going to end with a quote from Hunter S. Thompson. Life should not be a journey to the grave with the intention of arriving safely in a pretty and well-preserved body, but rather to skid in broadside in a cloud of smoke, thoroughly used up, totally worn out, and loudly proclaiming, "Wow, what a ride." And that's what I wish for you. Blessings on your path until we meet again. This is Renee LaValle McKenna for Spiritual Psychology.